Welcome to Cohesive Home Podcast Episode 2. In this episode, we'll be chatting about generational clutter. Listen on as Melissa and I share our favorite ideas for dealing with family clutter.
Cohesive Home is a podcast for families seeking a more intentional life. Looking for inspiration to create your ideal family culture and home? Kate and Melissa, two best friends and laid-back minimalists from opposite ends of the country, chat about all things parenthood, living simply, and crafting a happier home. So before we get started, I wanted to first say to everyone listening, thank you so much for joining us. We've received so many amazing questions and podcast topic suggestions, so make sure to subscribe to our podcast on iTunes and keep listening because I promise we will get to all of your questions. So, Kate, do you want to go ahead and kick off our discussion about generational clutter?
Absolutely. So I recently read an article from the Washington Post about how a lot of millennials are turning down their parents' hand-me-downs. The article talked about this cultural shift that is happening where many young adults are choosing different lifestyles than the way they grew up, making the fancy place settings and formal living room furniture of their childhood obsolete. So what happens to all that stuff when mom and dad downsize for retirement and their adult kids don't want it either?
Well, you know, all that generosity sometimes leads to throwing the stuff into a big black hole storage unit, which is actually a huge industry in the United States. I have a statistic here, and it's really mind-blowing. As Americans, we actually have over 2.3 billion square feet of storage rental space in our country. It's just crazy.
How is that even possible?
I have no idea.
So if only we could actually live in the storage units, right? But in all seriousness, we know that for some of you listening, you're trying to figure out how to help mom and dad or grandma minimize their stuff, or maybe you inherited a house full of stuff. So the big question is, how do we think about family possessions differently so that we can avoid the storage units in the first place and all of that family guilt?
Okay, so first, I think it's really, really important to mention that we are not at all saying that you shouldn't hang on to your family hand-me-downs that you just absolutely love and cherish. You know, it's just that we want to encourage you to find a balance between saying yes to grandma's sewing machine that you love and will use, and having the courage to say no to her 3-decade-old collection of Precious Moments figurines.
You know, Melissa, I also had some things that I had to save even though we minimized a lot. And one of the things was my grandmother's sewing box and her cedar trunk. And I agree with you that there are just some things you cannot get rid of, or at least that I can't.
I think the main point that we're trying to make here is that when you have a house full of unnecessary stuff, that the value of it tends to get lost in all of that clutter.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that our memories are not of the stuff, but of the people attached to it. Yeah. You don't need to hold on to the physical items because the memory itself is always with you. So we want to give you permission to not feel guilty if you need to get rid of family possessions.
Absolutely. No guilt. Absolutely no guilt. Okay, so one of my favorite ideas for remembering family heirlooms without actually keeping them is to take photographs of the items and keep them in a photo album or just digitally on your computer, unless you don't like to keep a lot of things on your computer, which it can get cluttered too, I guess. But anyway,
so true.
Yeah, you could even write like a little note next to each photo and kind of, you know, make sure that the photos don't get lost in all the shuffle, but maybe like a little special folder for it or something like that. Because we know it's hard, and we're here to remind you that you don't necessarily need the physical item in order to remember the person or event to hold on to those memories in your heart and your mind.
Right. And you know, if you have a big collection of items, sometimes it's easier to keep one of the collection rather than all of it. So if your mom's teapot collection reminds you of her, keep just one teapot and not all of them. But only you can decide what is worth keeping and what isn't. And honestly, the hardest part about generational clutter is learning to kindly refuse what you don't want before it even enters your home.
I totally agree. It's so easy to say yes to anything free. Mom calls and says, hey, we're getting rid of our couches because we bought new ones from Pottery Barn. And you're like, yes, we need new couches because we sold everything when we moved to Germany and they're free. Yeah.
Not like you would know anything about that, right?
No, not at all.
Right.
I don't know whose story that is.
Right. But sometimes, as you develop your home style, you may start to find that mom and dad's couches don't exactly fit in your home. So it's perfectly normal to want to design your house around what you love most. A cohesive home is one in which all of your belongings tell your family's beautiful and unique story. And we absolutely believe that you need to make your home your own, whether you live in a mansion or a travel trailer.
And if you do own a bigger house, remember, it's not your job to be the family storage unit for everyone else's stuff. Your home should be for living in, not for storing, but it can be hard to set those boundaries with other family members, especially if you're already storing stuff for other people in your home. Now, if they're alive, you may need to have an honest conversation with the person who's using your home as a storage unit. But if they've passed, you'll need to consider if now is the right time to let go of some of those things.
We know it can be so hard to get rid of stuff, especially if it was given to you after someone died. And the last thing on your mind is clutter when you're grieving a loss. And we want to encourage you to honor those emotions. Give yourself time to heal first. And when you're emotionally ready to tackle it, set aside some time to go through those boxes and process them. We definitely recommend having a family member or a good friend by your side for support and also to help with decision making. It's hard to think clearly after you've lost someone, and we know it can be super difficult, but it's best to do it as quickly as you possibly can.
Unfortunately, we tend to get busy. Pack a storage unit top to bottom, tell ourselves we'll deal with it later. But we are absolutely lying to ourselves when we do that. Storing unused belongings doesn't do anyone favors. It just drags out a natural grieving process by essentially shoving the issue under the rug. So, something I really struggle with, especially now as a homeschool mom, is figuring out what to do with all my kids' papers. Like old drawings and schoolwork and other random things that the kids make that are so beautiful, by the way, but there's so much of it.
But still,
so much.
What do you do with it?
I don't know. Help me.
Right. Definitely. I definitely agree with you. And one of the things I've been trying to decide is what to do with all of my girls' drawings, which ones actually deserve that coveted spot in a memory book, and what can be recycled. Don't tell.
Yeah, I know. Well,
So
I'll keep it a secret if you keep mine a secret.
Thank you. But, cue the mom guilt when I actually get rid of some of it. I feel bad.
Oh, and you try and hide it in the recycling bin so they won't see it. I'm like, put it at the bottom. Sorry.
My daughter, and my daughter finds it. She looks for it. It's got to stay one step ahead.
Sorry, Holland. I can hear her in the background. She goes, I can hear you. I'm sorry, Holland. Don't do it to everything, I promise.
No.
Okay.
But I also know that it can be a burden to sort through it as an adult, and I don't want to do that to my girls. My mom saved 2 huge storage boxes for me, which probably isn't actually that bad, but I still spent an entire day going through it all before I move. As much as I love gloating about my SAS Factory report cards from elementary school, I am pretty sure I don't actually need to keep those.
Well, and I don't want to overwhelm my kids someday by presenting them, this closet full of random childhood papers. I mean, yeah, I want them to see a storyline of their childhood, but seriously, come on, let's just focus on the highlights and not every single thing that ever happened to them.
I'm so glad someone finally said that.
They're great kids, but we don't need to keep all that stuff.
So if you're a parent listening we want to encourage you to make a game plan for all of the paper that will enter your home during the school years. Think about how to deal with it while also recording some of the memories. It's better to figure it out now than to have storage bins full of unorganized kid clutter later on down the road.
And if your kids are older and you've saved everything, now might be a really good time to sit down and declutter those boxes. Digitizing as much as you can and make peace with letting go of the, unimportant things.
Because at the end of our lives, are we going to be sad because we no longer have that last place ribbon from field day in 1992? Not that I have one or anything.
Me neither.
Okay, friends. Bottom line of today's podcast. Make peace with the past, declutter and digitize old memories, and choose to enjoy the present moment right now.
Make sure to subscribe to the Cohesive Home podcast on iTunes to catch the latest episodes. We would also love to hear what questions you have so that we can answer them in a future podcast. Send your questions to cohesivehome@gmail.com.
And in case we haven't made it clear enough yet, we actually love hearing your stories and interacting with you on Instagram. So subscribe to our newsletter to hear the latest from Cohesive Home at cohesivehome.com. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, will you share it with a friend? We would appreciate it. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
We're really excited and maybe a little nervous about our next topic. We're talking about reining in our technology use for us and our kids. Catch our next episode on iTunes March 2nd. Thanks again for listening to Cohesive Home Podcast, Episode 2.